start again. During communist times in the country of Moldova, there was an Adventist pastor by the name of Sergei Petrovich. Our believers could worship during the daytime, but they were always having to be careful because of the KGB spies that wanted against them. When they needed to have conference meetings, they had to meet at night illegally. And nobody ever knew until the last minute where or when they were going to meet. And so it was that the wives of the pastors would casually go down to the marketplace and just quietly pass the word around as to where and when the meeting would take place. Or sometimes at night time, the pastors would quietly go for a walk together and then pass the message on as to where the meeting was going to take place. At a certain time of the year, they needed to vote on the new conference president, and so they were going to have another meeting, and Pastor Sergei kissed his wife goodbye and went to the meeting. Pastor Victor Petya was voted in unanimously as the new conference president, and after the meeting, Pastor Sergei went home. He was tired, he went to sleep, and in the middle of the night, a terrible pounding on the door took place. And of course it was the KGB spies coming. They didn't give him very much time to say goodbye to his wife, and he had to go to headquarters where they were going to interrogate him for hours and hours to find out. They said to him, "We know that you had a meeting in the last 24 hours. Where was it? And who was present at the meeting?" And they went on, and of course he refused to give them the names of his fellow pastors. And so as a result, he was taken to headquarters and then sent to a prison in the city of Bricheni. On arrival, he was met by the warden. The warden was a very angry man who stated emphatically, "There is no God." He was put in solitary confinement. He was given water, but no food. Very early the next morning, Pastor Petrovich was startled by a scratching noise on the ledge above his bed. He looked, but it was too high up and he couldn't see who or what had made the noise. So he got up on his bed and felt up on the ledge, and oh, what's this? A piece of black Russian bread. He couldn't understand what this was all about. Then he thought, what shall I do? If I eat it and then tell the warden that I got some bread, he wouldn't believe me anyway. So he decided not to eat it. And then later that day, just before it got dark, another noise again, the same scratching noise. He tried to look again. He was too late to see who or what had brought it. But he carefully went up. Yes, another piece of bread. And so it went for the next 2 days. Very early in the morning, late at night, there was a piece of bread left on the ledge. Well, at the end of 3 days, he collected these pieces of bread, and he decided to put them under his mattress to keep them away from the rats. Now remember, by this time he was really very hungry, but he had decided that if he was going to eat the bread and tell the warden wouldn't believe him anyway. And then very early on the 4th day, the warden arrived, hoping now that the pastor had decided to end his foolishness in believing in his God. But instead, Pastor Sergei said to him, "No, I have just been praying to my God and thanking him for the bread that he sent me." "Bread? What are you talking about? We never gave you any bread." "Aha, wait a minute." He got under the mattress, pulled out 6 pieces of bread, and he said, "This is what I got." But the warden said, "We didn't send you bread." And then, all of a sudden, there was a scratching noise, and the two of them looked up, and they were in time this time to see a large black cat with a piece of black Russian bread in its mouth. And the warden, he couldn't understand. he said, I don't believe my eyes. I just can't believe this. I've never seen such a thing in my life before. Your God does exist after all, and he's going to be my God today. Because you see, today you've shown me something that I wouldn't believe all these years. Not only has your God sent you bread every morning and every evening, but he sent it as a present from me. Why, said Pastor Sergei? Listen, that black cat is my daughter's cat. And that bread is from my wife's table. So I have given you this bread and I didn't even know it. Now, can you imagine? And this is a true story. It only makes me think of the time when Elijah was hiding from King Ahab at the brook Cherith. You remember the story. God miraculously provided for his needs. We recall in 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 6, the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. On my bedroom ceiling is a luminous moon that's inscribed ravens and the cruse of oil. Whenever God performed miracles for Maureen and me since we arrived in Switzerland, and there were many miracles, we used to know that the ravens had brought food to us, because God helped us to survive miraculously, as both of us were doing private tutoring since 1994. Some of you people who've come here to Switzerland know how hard it is to get employment in Switzerland. Looking for work can be a long thing, sometimes taking people months or even a year or two to find work. And yet we were self-employed, well, I should say employed by God. The Lord took care of our needs since 1994 onwards, and I can't believe how the Lord has taken care of us. Coming back to the story about Pastor Sergei, I didn't tell you the story because of the black cat. That was not the point at all. What I wanted to get across was the fact that Pastor Sergei was prepared to worship God no matter what would happen, even if he had to die. He didn't know what was going to happen to him, and we don't know what's going to happen to us in the future. We may, in fact, in the years to come, maybe even less than years to come, maybe in the future, persecution and suffering and martyrdom may be something that we'll have to face. May we all, with the help of the Holy Spirit, remain faithful no matter what will come our way. In January 1959, as a young graduate from Helderberg College in South Africa, I arrived at Anderson School in Zimbabwe to begin teaching. But within a few days, before I had even unpacked my few belongings, I received a phone call from the mission director of Lower Guero College, stating that I had to go there instead of Anderson School because the man that they had called to come had had an affair and he was no longer could be employed by the church. He disappeared off the radar, and I don't know whether he carried on serving God or not, but Maureen and I did know his wife, and she remained faithful all through the years, even though her marriage had been broken up. Over the years, many things happened to us. Tragedies of one form or another. Depending on our reaction to what happens, we either remain faithful or leave the church. And let's face it, things do happen, and we can never just avoid all the troubles. So whether the troubles that come to us are our own fault or because of or not our own fault, we have to remain faithful. It's actually very sad to think that I've noticed over the years that after all the effort of evangelizing all around the world, as millions of new believers come into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, we don't always guard the back door. and so many good folks quietly slip out the back door, sometimes hardly even being noticed. And by the way, this is not only true in our church, but in all Christian denominations around the world. I remember reading a report some years ago in the Adventist news network highlighting this serious problem. And while preparing for the sermon, I was able to find online the very article that I had read some years ago. It was given by David Trim, Director of the Office of Archives, Statistics and Research for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and he gave these statistics at the General Conference Autumn Council in October 2015. And the shocking statement was, amongst other things that he said, that for every 100 new members that are baptized, around 40 of them would at some stage in the future leave the church. Can you imagine that? 40% could, over the years, just quietly leave. This situation was elaborated in 2 books authored by Tim Lale in the late 1990s. The first one being 10 Who Left, and the second one, 10 Who Came Back. In the first book, 10 people were interviewed and asked what the reasons were for their leaving the church. And in the second book, not only were they asked why they had left, but what brought them back. And it's interesting to note that fewer than 1 in 5 left the church because of the teaching of the church. Rather, many of them had not developed close relationships with fellow church members. Some of the time there were disagreements between members, sometimes misunderstandings. Sometimes they felt that they weren't being cared for or loved, and so quietly they left. Sometimes they felt that they were treated unjustly or being ignored, and that a lack of love had been shown to them. And then the shocking thing is that after they left the church, no one visited them to find out how they were doing. Sometimes they were young and immature and maybe had been divorced, and they needed to be nurtured and loved and cared for rather than just ignored. While I was registrar at Raoul College in the 1970s, it was my task to correspond with Tim Lale's parents, who were in the UK, as they wanted to come out to the mission field as teachers. Don and Anne Lale, Tim's parents, eventually came to Raoul as teachers, and they became our personal friends, and our son David was close friends with Tim, and so we knew the family well. Some years later, I was profoundly shocked one day when I went into a supermarket and I saw in the newspaper a picture of Don and Anne, and the headline was that they, by the way, who'd just a couple of months before gone to Nyazura mission, they had been murdered by a man who'd come onto the mission property looking for white people to kill. So their 2 sons, Tim and Andrew, after this terrible tragedy, left the church. And I'm sad to say that after all these years, Andrew has still not come back. David and I went to visit him and his wife just a few months ago when we were on a visit to the UK. But Tim had a different experience. He didn't only leave the church because his parents' murders, but as a young man, he was trying to understand his beliefs. And although he was British, he wanted to get a green card to work in the United States. And so he went and looked for employment and eventually found employment at Pacific Press in Idaho, where he was employed as a proofreader and later as a copy editor. He carefully didn't tell his employees and the rest of the people working there that he wasn't living as an Adventist, as a Christian. He just covered it up very carefully. But the interesting thing is that as he worked as a copy editor, he read himself back to faith. To me, it sounds like a bit of a miracle. After a period of time, disillusioned as most young people are, he read his way back into faith with God, and he learned how important it was for us to be loving and lovable Christians, and to be caring individuals as well. As far as I recall, because my son David and I keep in touch with him, he's in the States. As far as I know, he is at present, among other things, editing the new SDA digital Bible commentary. So the Lord has his way of leading us, and through all of the ups and downs that we go through, let us remain faithful. There are a myriad excuses that people can use for stopping to attend church after being treated unkindly or maybe unjustly. And I remember that my wife Maureen had once said to me that long before we had even met, way back in the Guerra church, there was an elder who was not reappointed, so he stopped going to church. And sometimes it might be a little thing. People might say, well, they looked at me funny and so I'm not going to come to church anymore. All this sort of thing. We've got to be very careful. There's two sides to the story. Either that we are not as friendly and not as kind as we should be to others, and that people would not take any old excuse just to leave church, because it can happen to any one of us. Some people leave church when tragedies occur that are not their own fault. Maybe a death in the family, a loss of employment, severe illness, or times when they've been treated unjustly. And while I'm speaking, I'd like each one of you to think back on your own experiences and try to pinpoint periods of crisis in your lives when you could easily have decided to give up on God, but you decided to stay loyal to him anyway. I'm sure that we've all had these ups and downs, and at any stage we could easily have given up, even though we didn't understand why what was happening to us had happened. And that makes me think of Job. Just think of the story of Job. He didn't know why the Sabaeans had taken all his oxen and asses, why his sheep and his servants were burnt alive, why his 7 sons and 3 daughters and their families were killed, and why, on top of all of that, he was covered with boils all over his body. And as he spoke to his wife, we read in Job chapter 2, verse 10, "But he said to her, 'You speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?' In all this, Job did not sin with his lips." Some of you may know our story. I shared it in a sermon here on forgiveness in 2014. But because so many of you who are present today were not here 9 years ago, I'm going to share it again. In 1984, I was the one and only maths teacher at Helderberg High School near to Cape Town. After teaching for 1 year, a week into the new school year, a group of parents, instigated by their children, went to the school board and said that unless I was removed from the school, they would take their children out of the school. Now the school board and also the conference were faced with a big problem, because as usual they were having a hard time balancing the budget, and if I remained at the school, they would lose several students. And so they took the decision to bow to pressure, and I was let go. I had actually done nothing morally wrong except to work until midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. I had taught the son of one of my friends, and he came home after I'd taught him only for a week, and he said, "I got the best math teacher I had in my whole life, and they fired me." We were absolutely heartbroken, as all I'd ever wanted to do was to work in denominational employment for the rest of my working life. And it was kind of hard now, after having been in denominational employment for 24 and a half years, 18 of which in teaching and 6 as a coal porter, and most of it in Zimbabwe. Many people sympathized with us, and we could have left the church altogether or stopped believing in God. But we decided to continue being faithful to him, and I carried on being an elder in the Helderberg church. While everyone at Helderberg knew what had happened, elsewhere we didn't talk too much to people because we didn't want folks to criticize the church administration. Very fortunately, I was very soon able to get employment in the state high school, and because my qualifications and my many years of teaching were recognized, I earned a fairly good salary. A couple of years later, I was moved to a very large African high school in Khayelitsha near Cape Town, where I was appointed the head of maths, science and biology for several years. And the Lord blessed us amazingly, because at that time we were able to buy the one and only house that we ever owned. Before coming to Switzerland, I'd been employed in state schools for 9 years, and that added to 24 and a half years in church employment meant that I would not have had 40 years working for the same organization, and therefore would not have nearly enough money to be able to retire when I reached retiring age. We prayed and prayed about this. We didn't know what the Lord was going to do. And we looked at the situation and we realized that because our son David had left for Switzerland in 1992, and because we knew that our daughter Nerida and her husband Dave were going to move to the United States in the very near future, we realized that as the South African currency continued to decline, we would have more and more trouble being able to be able to visit our own children here in Europe and also in the United States. So we made the decision to come to Switzerland without a great deal of money. We were extremely grateful to have Swiss nationality through my father, who had been a Swiss watchmaker. And as I've looked back over the last 29 years, in fact almost 30 years, in Geneva, I cannot believe how God has been so incredibly good to us. He blessed me and Maureen. Maureen was appointed to head the one and only Pittman Center in Switzerland, and in our apartment she taught typing, what you call keyboarding, and word processing, each on 3 levels, to one student at a time. And her students wrote Pittman exams in those 2 subjects, obtaining qualifications that were recognized all around the world. A few days ago, I looked through the files that I've kept of Maureen's. After she died in June 2015, my daughter Nerida and I went through all her papers, and we found all the application forms for her students that had been filled in, and we discovered that she had taught a total of 182 students, each individually, over the years. I did private math tutoring, which I'm still doing. I could have become bitter because I was still working well beyond the age of 65 and not just retiring. But it gradually occurred to me that continuing to teach was not a burden, but actually a privilege, because I had a reason to get up every morning. I had a reason to do something each day. And we were able to visit Nerida, my daughter, and her family every year in the United States, except when Maureen landed in hospital and then later on in the old age home. I can honestly say that we put any bitterness that we'd had behind us. And of course we forgave the individuals concerned as they'd indirectly done us a favor. If I had not been asked to leave Helderberg High School, Maureen and I would never have gone to teach in state schools, thus enabling us to have the financial resources to be able to move to Switzerland. Because we stuck with the Lord, He worked things out for us more amazingly than we could ever have imagined, even though it took us around 9 years for our prayers to be answered. Can you imagine why it is that Romans 8:28 is one of my all-time favorite Bible texts? Let's share it together. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His promise. May we never forget that God didn't cause the mess-ups in our lives. And mess-ups do happen. It was Satan all the time who was trying to cause the problems that came to us. We also realize that sometimes God allows problems to come to us so that we may learn precious spiritual truths, precious lessons. May we accept the help of the Holy Spirit and remain faithful to God, no matter what crises may come our way. On the other hand, of course, troubles come to us because of the way we live. So when things go wrong in our lives that we have brought upon ourselves, we have nobody to blame but ourselves. But the funny thing is, even though we have no reason to blame anybody but ourselves, we being the way we are sometimes rather perverse. And so because we're unwilling to take responsibilities for our own mistakes, we may be tempted to try to put the blame on somebody else or on God, who is not the cause of our problems. And that is precisely the situation I found myself in some years ago. In Zimbabwe, Osteni Ntini had faithfully worked for us for about 18 years. He did the cooking, the housekeeping, and he took care of our many animals while we went on holiday. He was a good person, and we appreciated his faithfulness. However, after arriving in Switzerland, we received a letter from his son Abraham, who was born after we left Zimbabwe, asking for our help. So I had never physically met Abraham myself. For some years we had assisted Osteni's family by helping to educate his children and by helping Abraham with some of his projects. At some stage Osteni died, and then in 2012, as our finances were becoming very stretched, I wrote to Abraham stating that from then onwards, any help that I would give him would have to be on loan, because I didn't have the money just to dish out anymore. I kept a careful note of the amount of each loan and the dates, etc., and gradually the requests began to pile up. This went on for 5.5 years, from 2012 onwards, until one day in 2017, my son David phoned me one afternoon, and he told me straight. He said, listen, he said, Dad, Mr. Temiri, the manager of Standard Bank Services, does not exist. Mr. Suarez, the accountant of MoneyGram Services, does not exist either. And that Abraham has been spinning you stories to get more and more money from you. That very week, I was preparing a sermon on the two Abrahams, the one in the Bible and the other Abraham to whom I had been lending money. And then all of a sudden I realized that sermon would not fit anymore, because the Abraham I was going to preach about had done the dirty on me. And instead of him being willing to pay back all the loans that I'd made to him, here I was sitting pretty with all that trouble. So I was actually, and David, I told him, I said, David, I'm going to preach a sermon this week. He said, can't you get somebody else to preach your sermon for you? So I phoned Brother Boilia and said I was in the middle of a personal crisis. Would he be willing to take my sermon for me? And he did. And it was a relief at that time. And then around about that time, I started speaking to Pastor Clifford, sharing with him some of the emails between me and Abraham. And Pastor Clifford just told me straight, he said, Abraham is a ruthless crook. I can't tell you how much Pastor Clifford helped me. I'll never forget his help. This is why Pastor Clifford is so very precious to me. My son's intervention was also crucial at this time, as well as my daughter Nereid and her husband Dave. What was so painful to me was the fact that I told Abraham that my wife is in hospital. And then I told him, look, my wife has died. Didn't matter a thing to him. He just carried on. Made no difference. He carried on spinning his clever stories. And I was like an insect caught in a spider's web. Until one day, when I was in a museum with my cousin Helen, just next to the train station in Zurich, I got a phone call from Abraham, and he was upset. He said that his boss was a Muslim, and his boss was insisting on burning incense at work. I said to him, Abraham, Muslims don't burn incense. This is the end. By the time I was able to extricate myself from this horrible situation in 2017, I was in terrible debt. A situation that I'd vigorously refused and shunned all my life. I'm ashamed to admit that I lost a great deal of money over the course of the 5.5 years that I was in this experience. My own stupidity, of course. A very precious couple lent me some money and gave me a certain amount, and it took me ages to recover from this awful experience. I'm ashamed to admit how much of God's money I lost, because remember, all the money we have is on trust to us to use wisely as stewards. Psalm 50 verse 10 tells us, for every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. So when we have money, we have to use it as trust, as God's stewards. And so at 80 years of age, I had to pick up the pieces and start again, as it were. I had no one to blame but myself. And this my son David reminded me of. I couldn't blame God, but as I say, sometimes we do stupid things. We blame God for things that were our own fault. But I didn't blame God at this time. But I realized that I had taken so long to wake up to the clever lies that had been spun to me. This is the first time that I've actually shared this episode publicly. And I've put it behind me. And I've forgiven Abraham for what he did to me, even though it was one of the most difficult experiences that I've ever had to do. Remember what God told us in Matthew 6, verse 15. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. Even in the most terrible situations, we have to let go of our anger, hatred, and bitterness, and forgive those who've wronged us. Otherwise, we'll be the ones destroyed with hatred, and we will lose heaven in the process. The Helder debacle and my experience for Abraham were the most difficult crises I've ever had to face in my whole life. However, looking back at the last 6 years, since I've been able, with the Lord's help, to extricate myself from Abraham's clutches, now at the age of 86, almost 87, I can look back in incredible amazement at how wonderfully the Lord has helped me, not only to recover from this awful experience, but absolutely to flourish with the help of the Holy Spirit and with my marvelous circle of family, friends, fellow church members, students, and their parents. Next to my desk is a filing cabinet absolutely filled with the files of previous students whom I've taught since 1994. I can hardly fit another file in. Many of them have stayed with me for 4 or 5 or 6 years, or until they left school. All I can say is, praise be to our wonderful God. Throughout, I've asked God to help me to be faithful and loyal to Him no matter what happens. We all mess up terribly, but with God's help, with the Lord helping us, let us be willing to to ask Him to carry us through and ask Him to help us. Again, let us all look at the crises that we've had to pass through. How did we react to them during the trauma that we passed through? Did we remain faithful, regardless of what happened, and that God would take us through? In 2018, a large group of us went to northern Italy, to the town of Torre Pellice, to visit some of the places where the Waldensians worshipped God while hiding in the mountain fortresses to avoid persecution. In Great Controversy, page 78, we read that the persecutions visited for many centuries upon this God-fearing people were endured by them with a patience and constancy that honored their Redeemer. They were hunted to the death, yet their blood watered the seed sown, and it failed not of yielding fruit. I love the text in Joshua 24, verse 15. And if it seem evil to you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods whom your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. In appearing to each of us to remain faithful to the Lord, it sounds a bit strange because those who have stopped attending church are not present here today. But for those of us who are here, may we encourage each other to remain faithful, and as we sometimes say colloquially, to hang in there, as we would put it in common terms. When tragedy strikes, and it will happen, whether it is our own fault or not, let us not leave, but let us cling to God. He will carry us through. May the Lord bless us.